This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so are you ready to really unpack Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, let's do it.
Because it's one of those things you hear about. It's like, oh yeah, Pearl Harbor, we all know about that.
Right.
But I think we have a stack of sources here that I think are going to shed some light on some things that maybe we didn't know about.
Oh, absolutely.
And so this is not going to be just a dry, this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Right.
This is really about, the world at the time and all the different forces that were pushing towards, this event.
Yeah, there were a lot of things sort of bubbling under the surface leading up to that moment.
Yeah, so much more than just the day itself.
Right.
So to kick things off, I think we need to rewind the clock a bit and talk about Japan in the early 20th century.
Okay.
You've got some sources in here that paint a picture of a country that was on a rocket ship. They were rapidly industrializing. They had these dreams of building an empire across Asia.
Yeah.
And they had this insatiable need for resources.
Yeah.
Especially oil.
Yeah. Japan being an island nation, they're really lacking in these key resources. They needed oil to fuel their navy, their factories, everything.
They couldn't just stay put and, build up internally.
Right, exactly. They had to look outward. And that's where those imperial ambitions start to come in.
They looked at the European powers and saw that model of, colonizing and expanding.
Yeah, they saw that as the path to success.
Yeah.
Taking Manchuria for its coal and iron was just the beginning.
So that was just step one.
Yeah. And by 1937, they were fully engaged in the Second Sino-Japanese War, aiming to control China and secure its resources.
So it wasn't just about expanding their territory. It was really about getting their hands on what they needed to keep the country running.
Exactly. Resources were absolutely key to their plans.
But all this put them on a collision course with the U.S.
Right. The U.S. had their own interests in the Pacific, and these aggressive moves by Japan were seen as a direct threat.
Okay, so things are starting to heat up here.
Definitely.
And then there's the oil embargo.
Right.
Japan relied heavily on the U.S. for oil.
Yeah, something like 80% of their imports.
Yeah, and then suddenly in July of 1941, the U.S. just cuts them off.
Yeah, the Roosevelt administration saw Japan's expansion into French Indochina as a step too far. They were trying to force Japan to back down.
But wouldn't that just make them more desperate if they needed the oil that badly? Did the U.S. miscalculate how much this would push Japan towards war?
It's a good question, and historians still debate that, some argue that the U.S. underestimated Japan's willingness to fight.
And you have to remember that Japan's military had a very strong hold on the government at this time.
Oh, absolutely. They were already deeply invested in the war in China, and many of them believed that war with the U.S. was inevitable.
So even with the economic pressure from the embargo, there were already these powerful forces within Japan pushing for military action.
Right. The embargo added fuel to the fire for sure, but it wasn't the only source of tension.
Okay, so there's more.
Yeah. U.S. support for China during the Second Sino-Japanese War was another major point of contention for Japan.
So you've got Japan feeling the squeeze from the embargo, resenting the U.S. support for China, and believing that war might be their only way out.
It was a very volatile mix.
But did anyone try to talk this through? I mean, surely there were attempts at diplomacy before things escalated to a full-blown attack.
There were attempts, yes. Throughout 1941, the U.S. and Japan engaged in some pretty tense negotiations, hoping to find a peaceful resolution.
So they were talking.
Yeah. But the talks were overshadowed by a lot of mistrust, and, they had fundamentally opposing goals.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tough.
It was.
One of your sources mentioned something called the Whole Note.
Oh, right.
What was that all about?
The Whole Note was basically an ultimatum from the U.S. delivered in late November of 1941.
Okay.
It demanded that Japan withdraw completely from China and French Indochina.
Wow. So just pack up and go home after all that.
Basically. And for Japan, that was a non-starter. It would have meant admitting defeat, losing face on the world stage,
Okay.
and abandoning their vision of a Pan-Asian empire.
So the Whole Note was basically the opposite of what they wanted.
Right. And instead of diffusing the situation, it probably made things worse.
The U.S. was drawing a line in the sand.
Exactly. And Japan felt like they were backed into a corner with no acceptable options.
So diplomacy is failing.
Yeah.
The stage is set for a military solution.
Unfortunately.
And that brings us to the heart of Japanese power at the time, the military.
Right.
You've got some really interesting sources here that describe a Japan that's basically being run by a military dictatorship, with figures like General Tojo and Admiral Yamamoto holding immense sway.
Yeah, they were powerful figures.
So let's talk about these figures and how they influenced the decision to attack Pearl Harbor.
Okay, by the late 1930s, Japan's government was basically a military dictatorship.
Yeah.
Figures like General Tojo, the prime minister,
Right.
really embodied that aggressive militaristic spirit.
Yeah.
They genuinely believed that Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia, and by force, if necessary.
Wow.
To them, war with the U.S. wasn't a question of if,
Right.
but when.
Wow. Okay, and what about Admiral Yamamoto?
Yeah.
The man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Right.
He seems like a more complex figure.
He is.
I've read that he actually studied in the U.S.
Yeah.
and understood their industrial might.
Yeah, Yamamoto's a fascinating character.
Yeah.
He spent time in the U.S., studied at Harvard, even served as a naval attaché.
Huh.
So he knew firsthand how powerful the U.S. was.
Wow.
And he actually warned that Japan couldn't win a prolonged war against them.
So if he knew a long war was unwinnable,
Right.
why advocate for such a bold attack?
Well, Yamamoto believed that a swift, decisive blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet could buy Japan valuable time
Okay.
to solidify their control over Southeast Asia.
Okay.
He was hoping to secure those vital resources, especially oil,
Right.
before the U.S. could fully mobilize for war.
So it was like a gamble.
As a gamble, a calculated risk, designed to shock the U.S. into negotiating a favorable peace settlement.
So he was betting on the U.S. being caught off guard and then backing down?
That was the idea, and to his credit, the attack on Pearl Harbor did achieve tactical surprise.
Okay.
It inflicted significant damage on the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Okay, so let's break down the attack itself and the immediate aftermath. What were the key outcomes?
Yeah.
Did Yamamoto achieve his goal of crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet?
On December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles out,
Wow.
hitting Pearl Harbor with stunning precision.
Mm-hmm.
Battleships were sunk or heavily damaged aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans were killed.
A date which will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt said.
Exactly.
Oh.
But there was a crucial element of Yamamoto's plan that didn't pan out.
Oh.
The U.S. aircraft carriers.
Oh.
They weren't in port that day.
So the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet
Right.
remained unscathed.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty big miss.
It was destroying the carriers would have been a much more significant blow to the U.S. Navy's long-term fighting capacity.
Right.
And as the war played out, those carriers would prove to be decisive.
So it sounds like Pearl Harbor was a tactical success for Japan, but strategically it might have been a different story.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
While they achieved surprise and inflicted heavy damage,
Right.
Japan missed a crucial opportunity to really cripple the U.S. Navy's long-term capability.
Yeah.
And perhaps even more importantly, they misjudged the American response.
What do you mean?
They underestimated how the U.S. and the American people would react to such an attack.
Okay.
See, before Pearl Harbor, there was strong isolationist sentiment in the U.S.
Right.
Many Americans wanted to stay out of the European conflict.
Yeah, focus on domestic issues.
Exactly. But the attack on Pearl Harbor shattered that isolationism.
It was a direct attack on American soil.
It was a deeply personal affront,
Right?
and it galvanized the nation.
It was a complete turning point.
It was.
Public opinion shifted dramatically.
Yeah.
And suddenly there was this unified sense of purpose, a national determination to avenge the attack and defeat Japan.
Overnight, the U.S. went from debating involvement in the war to wholeheartedly committing its vast industrial and military might to the Allied cause.
So in a sense, Yamamoto's gamble backfired.
Yeah.
He wanted to buy Japan time,
Right.
but instead he awakened a sleeping giant.
That's a powerful way to put it. The attack intended to keep America OUT of the Pacific.
Right.
Had the exact opposite effect.
Wow.
It drew them in with a vengeance.
This really highlights the unintended consequences of war.
Yeah.
It's impossible to predict how events will unfold and how people will react.
It's a stark reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can go awry.
Right.
Especially when you fail to grasp the full picture, the human element, the potential for unforeseen consequences.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Japan's imperial ambitions, the pressure cooker of the oil embargo, the failed diplomacy, the role of Japanese militarism, and the unintended consequences of the attack itself. But one thing that strikes me is we've covered a lot of ground here. Japan's imperial ambitions, the pressure cooker of the oil embargo, the failed diplomacy, the role of Japanese militarism, and the unintended consequences of the attack itself. But one thing that strikes me is how focused we've been on the big picture, the geopolitics, the strategy. It's easy to forget that these events, these decisions played out on the backs of real people.
That's an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the grand narrative of history, but we must never forget the human cost of war.
Our sources only briefly touch on it, but the human impact of Pearl Harbor was immense. We talked about the more than 2,400 Americans killed in the attack. What about their families, their communities?
Yeah.
And what about the Japanese soldiers who carried out the attack, many of whom also lost their lives?
It's crucial to remember that behind every statistic, every strategic decision, there were individuals with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the war that followed had a profound impact on countless lives on both sides of the conflict.
And those ripples continue to this day. The legacy of Pearl Harbor shapes how we view conflict, diplomacy, and even national identity.
It reminds us of the importance of clear communication, understanding different perspectives, and the need to exhaust all peaceful options before resorting to war. The events of December 7, 1941 serve as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of miscalculation and the enduring human cost of conflict.
So we've delved deep into the complexities of Pearl Harbor with us today. We've explored the historical context, the key players, the strategic decisions, and the global repercussions of this pivotal event. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've talked a lot about the why of Pearl Harbor, but what about the what now? How does understanding this event with all its complexities and tragedies inform our understanding of the world today? What lessons can we draw from the past to help us navigate the challenges of the present and future? That's something I encourage you to explore further on your own. Until next time, keep diving.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.